Welcome to the Understanding the Impacts of the Pandemic on the College Enrollment through Research Center Publications. And thank you for joining us. With us today are two members of the National Student Clearinghouse's Research Center. Dr. Doug Shapiro is the Executive Director of the Research Center, and Dr. Mikyung Ryu is the Director of Research Publications. And I'll now hand it over to Doug. Doug.
And we know how valuable your time is, so we're especially appreciative that you're able to spend some of it with Mikyung and myself. And we're going to talk about how the pandemic has affected student enrollment and transfer behaviors this year, both in the fall and what is emerging in our latest releases this spring. And this all comes from the enrollment data that your colleges submit to the Clearinghouse and the reports based on those data that are published by the Research Center. So we also want to thank you for your contributions that make this information possible. Mikyung and I will walk you through some of the data and the results, and then some of the key takeaways and implications, both for students and for institutions, before we go to Q&A. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about our research publications. And I know that you're all familiar with how we've been providing objective and timely information about student enrollment and outcomes for years. But timely has a whole new meaning today in the age of COVID. As you know, we've never seen a crisis in education that happened so fast and so devastatingly as this one. And at the Research Center, we saw this huge need for much more rapid information than what we had been providing in the past. And to address that, we determined to report out as enrollment data arrived throughout the fall and spring, understanding that these results are preliminary, but was much more important to have the information in your hands soon enough while it was still time to act and to take action where appropriate, rather than to wait as we normally did until we could account for every last student before publishing. So to do this, we developed a new methodology that compares same institutions year over year, using their prior year report as a pre-pandemic baseline. And you'll see that throughout our conversation today. For example, we analyzed the rate of change in enrollments from fall 2019 to fall 2020 and compare the underlying pre-pandemic trend that's indicated by the rate of change from fall 2018 to fall 2019. We then update this information frequently so that our reports show the enrollment picture getting clearer as the data accumulate, as the term goes on, just like the running vote tallies that you might see on TV on election night, with the percent of precincts reporting always there to indicate where we are in the returns. And just to give you a sense of the new publications that we have developed with these imperatives and these new methods, we had an entire series of Stay Informed enrollment reports that started in June of last year, and we've produced 6 issues so far, nearly once every month in the fall. The second is our transfer and mobility and progress reports, specially designed again for the COVID pandemic. And these reports focus on student transfer patterns. And we've produced 2 of those in the fall and 1 already this spring. And we'll continue to update those throughout the year. And finally, we've also provided a special report for our high school enrollment patterns, our high school benchmarks, that focused again on the up-to-the-minute COVID special analysis for year-over-year changes in the pandemic. So if you remember back to last April and May, there was huge uncertainty in what was going to happen in the fall, and absolutely no way to predict the impact of this crisis. And yet, there were all kinds of predictions being made, based mostly on very few facts at all, about how the pandemic would affect college students and institutions. And some of the predictions I'm listing on this slide, you'll recognize for sure. College enrollments, for example, people thought would drop dramatically, up to 20%, except that community colleges, people thought were going to grow because unemployed adults would return for job training and re-education. New high school graduates were expected to take gap years. Current students were expected to drop out or stop out. Disruptions in travel and family finances would cause more students to transfer, particularly four-year students who might be switching to community colleges to stay closer to home and avoid travel and save money. And upward transfers, by the same token, would decrease. Fewer students would be transferring into four-year institutions from community colleges. And finally, an expectation that racial and ethnic minoritized students would be much more affected because they had been so much more vulnerable and so much more affected by the pandemic and the recession themselves. And what our data has shown so far is quite contrary to these predictions for the most part. Undergraduate drops overall are not nearly as steep as predicted, but some categories of students did in fact fall by 20%. Community colleges are the worst hit by far, and returning adult enrollment, in particular the expectation of a recession bump in adult enrollments, has not happened. Adult enrollment has not increased at community colleges. And continuing students enrollment did fall, but only at community colleges. It increased at four-year schools where students mostly stayed put. We did see that we saw that upward transfers increased overall, and both in-state and out-of-state. But our data suggests nonetheless that the pandemic is having strong differential impacts on disadvantaged students, further expanding the existing disparities along gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic lines. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Mi-Kyung to dig into more of the details of the data, and then I'll come back later when we talk about the implications.
Thank you, Doug. Hi, everyone. My name is Mi-Kyung. I will help you walk through some detailed level look at the data trends that we have been publishing over the last 12 months. So let's start with the fall trend. Here's what we have found last fall, summarized at very high levels. Undergraduate enrollment declined 4.4%. That decline is continuing into spring. And graduate enrollment increased 2.9% last fall. Therefore, overall enrollment is down 3.3%. And please note that undergraduate enrollment declines are occurring at all types of institutions across all racial ethnic categories, as well as age and gender groups. Most of the pain was in the community college sector, as you might have heard already, showing about 9 to 10% decline. For-profits and online institutions, primarily online institutions, on the other hand, they were growing. Freshman enrollment was down 13% nationally and down 19% at community colleges. Now, are these trends continuing to spring? The answer is yes. Undergraduate enrollment is declining, graduate students are growing, and the enrollment declines are the far worse, the worst hit sector by the pandemic, community college sector. And online and for-profit institutions are growing. The one last item, the freshman enrollment, we are going to look at this freshman enrollment trends in the future report. So let's hold up on that just for now. So roughly 6 weeks into the spring term, the patterns that we have reported last fall look very much like similar trends are continuing. So the graduate students are growing even at a higher rate. And now the undergraduate enrollment at the public four-year sector is currently dropping more than what we reported last fall. So those are the two main, the notable changes from the fall. First-time freshman data, actually, it was the biggest surprise to many of us. So the fall freshman declined very steeply and it's very staggering to see the 19% decline at the community college sector. And that's especially because they were actually the only institution sector with an increase during prior to the pandemic. So it is a reversal of the gain they were making prior to the pandemic. If you look at public four-year and community colleges in comparison, the declines in freshmen is community college decline in freshmen is actually more than twice the rate. Pretty staggering decline. And please note that the freshman enrollment were declining already prior to the pandemic among public four-year, two-year, as well as the nonprofit four-year sectors, but the declines are not nearly as dramatic as last fall. So this is a perfect example of the pandemic appearing to take existing trends, disparities, and accelerating that existing gaps to much worse levels. Let's look at what was already happening prior to the pandemic. These are from our standard current term enrollment estimate report. The blue bars are pre-pandemic trend. Things were not going so great to begin with. Approximately 1 to 1.5% annual declines overall, with the traditional four-year college sector doing slightly better, community college sector slightly worse, and the for-profits in the free fall until 2019. Red bars indicate the trends in during the pandemic. Community colleges, as I said, by far the worst hit sector in terms of percent change as well as a headcount number changes. Last fall, more than 500,000 students were lost in undergraduate enrollment. The 4 years are actually in fairly good shape, even during the pandemic, all things considered. But for-profits increased by a larger percentage, but the headcount numbers are very small. At the state level, last fall, the fall 2020 maps on the right are in mostly dark shade of red, which indicates deep declines. Regionally speaking, Midwest, West, and Northeast, they were declining between 5% and 3% from the last fall, the year before. And the South was declining less steeply, around 1%. And you've already noticed the exceptions on the map. The growth in Utah and New Hampshire during the pandemic. Those are approximately 5% and 16% increases respectively. And these are mostly due to large online institutions based in those two states. Other large online institutions are often multi-state institutions, and those are not shown on these maps. Generally speaking, primarily online institutions, those who enroll more than 90% of their students exclusively online program, even before the pandemic started, they grew quite a bit during the pandemic, around 5%, right along with the for-profit institutions. But between these two types of institutions, there is a fair amount of overlap. So how does the spring enrollment look at the state level? It looks very similar to the fall trends. The undergraduate enrollment is largely in red and orange color, indicates the declines overall, pretty much across the board. And with a few exceptions in up northeast area, and then Oregon, Utah, Wyoming, but those are relatively small states. And in comparison with mostly blue map for graduate level enrollment growth on the right. And this is information based on the limited data coverage, 43% of institutions as of February 11. And we are updating this information very soon. Now, let's go deeper dive into the specific data, the points here. With all of the next following charts, you're going to look at year-over-year changes in 2021 displayed on the right compared to the previous year pre-pandemic patterns on the left. Note that all spring enrollment data are still preliminary, so they are subject to revision as well. So let's look at by institution sector. Public four-year colleges experienced a steeper decline than last fall. Right now, it shows a 3.3% decline. Last fall, it was a 1.9% decline. But same as last fall, the community colleges are the most affected sector. It shows a very much same level of declines as last fall. 9.5%. And overall, undergraduate enrollment decline is very similar to last fall, 4.5% in the spring. Last fall, it was a 4.4%. By credential type, these patterns are very much similar to the one previous slide. So if we look at by credential type, you can see associate and bachelor's degree enrollment level are declining much steeper than other credential type. And one thing you notice, this blue bar, the certificate enrollments are up, especially at the graduate level, by 15.4%. And also master's degree program is actually accelerating in growth. Spring 5.3% this spring compared to below 2% last year. When we look at spring graduate enrollment by sector, you see all of them are increasing compared to the last spring. So grand total, if you see 1.5% was the rate of growth prior to the pandemic. Now it's jumped to 4.3% growth. Now, I want to turn to the COVID trends report that Doug was mentioning. In normal times, the transfer plays an important part of more accessible and more affordable pathways to bachelor's degrees, particularly for those more disadvantaged student population. Many people fear that the pandemic would limit these important pathways to bachelor's degree attainment. And that's what we have been finding in the fall, and similar trends are continuing into the spring. So first of all, the overall transfer enrollment is running 8% below pre-pandemic levels. This spring as well as last fall, it's a continuing trend. This pandemic is causing fewer students to transfer, not more. Many students who would have transferred either stayed put, stopped out, or if they were already stopped out prior to the pandemic, continue to stay out. Secondly, the all transfer pathways continue to be impacted during the pandemic. Both reverse transfers and lateral transfers, both of them dropped sharply, 18 to 21% for reverse transfers and 9 to 12% for lateral transfers, depending on the term. Reverse transfer seems to be declined the most, which is counter to the expectation that more students from four-year schools would try to reduce costs and travel by switching to nearby community colleges, since instructions are delivered largely online during the pandemic. That simply did not happen. In terms of lateral transfer, we see also sharp decline, about 9% overall in the spring. And between 2-year and 4-year, the rate of decline is very similar. Finally, upward transfer. This shows a slightly deviating patterns. Spring, they are currently increasing by 3%, but they have fallen slightly last fall, declining less than 1%. And upward transfer this spring are growing in state as well as out of state. However, this 3% growth is based on a very small number of transfer student population this spring, about half of the fall transfer student population. And also importantly, the 3% increase is from last spring, not from the last fall. So let me turn over to Doug for you to see the disparities of patterns that we are seeing.
Thanks, McYoung. So I'm going to turn a little bit more to questions of equity and access. And first will be I just want to drill down a little bit on the upward transfer pathway. As you know, students moving from community colleges to four-year institutions are really seen as an important pathway for access and increased student success and diversity in attainment of the bachelor's degree. But what we've seen in the transfer data is that the existing gaps in equity and diversity have grown even wider during the pandemic. The declines for Black and Latinx students, declines in the number of upward transfers, as you can see in this chart, were 2 to 3 times as steep as they were for white students this fall. While transfers among Asian students actually jumped, particularly at private colleges. So some students seem to have been able to take advantage of an increased opportunity to transfer from a community college to a four-year institutions, while the most disadvantaged students traditionally have fallen further behind. There's also some variation in the terms. In the fall, the declines in upward transfer were mostly among Black and Hispanic students, as you see. But in the spring, we saw upward transfers decline also among white students, equally to the Black populations, and more than they did in both cases prior to the pandemic. And Latinx students in the spring are actually growing in the 4-year in transferees to the 4-year. So things are a little bit different in the spring, but again, the spring data are more preliminary and based on a smaller number of students, typically, including in this year, who transfer in the middle of an academic year. So let's pull back up from the transfers and look at the demographics among all undergraduates. And again, what we see in general is that existing gaps in access and enrollment from before the pandemic are growing wider due to the pandemic. And in some cases, they're erasing progress that had been made in previous years. It's clear that all race and ethnicity categories, as you'll see, show declines, of course, but Native Americans, Black and Latinx students in particular have been falling more steeply than others. And while all ages are affected, we see startling differences between men and women, 3 to 4 times steeper declines in many cases among men than women. We've certainly seen declines in international students, and this is true at both undergraduate and graduate levels. But there is some good news in graduate enrollment growth among Black and Latinx students. So let's start with just these pictures of undergraduate versus graduate declines by race. And so first off, you see the huge declines in international students at both levels, large increases in the graduate enrollments in every single race and ethnicity category among domestic students, and large declines in all the undergraduate categories, especially international students. But really severe, 12.5% fewer Native American undergraduates this spring, and these were equally large, if not larger, in the fall. But white students in the spring data are declining almost as much as Blacks, and they're actually lagging behind Black and Hispanic students at the graduate level in terms of the increases. Whereas Hispanic students seem to be doing relatively better at both levels, smaller declines at the undergraduate and larger growth at the graduate level. But when you look at the changes from 2019, you see some of the underlying demographic trends. Before the pandemic, Hispanic students were increasing last year, as they have been generally as a percent of the population for some time. So Hispanic students should be continuing to grow. So the fact that they declined even by 5% is quite a swing and a startling a reversal for the progress that we've seen in Hispanic students in recent years. When we focus on community colleges, things start to look far worse. And I want to start by just calling your attention to the gray bars in this chart. The total decline by race is severe for every single racial and ethnic category on the chart. In any normal year, you might look at this, the relative declines for white and Asian students. Well, they're smaller than many of the other bars on this chart, but let's be clear: 11% fewer students this spring compared to last spring for white undergraduates, or sorry, white community college students is huge. And 13% fewer Black and Latinx students, and 17% fewer Native American students. It's just staggering. Not to mention the difference between men and women in every racial category here, almost a 2-to-1. Actually, literally 2-to-1 in most of these categories. So to see 20% fewer Black men on community college campuses this spring, and that's unchanged from the fall. Similarly, in the Latinx category, 19% fewer men, 24% fewer Native American students. These numbers are simply devastating, and even among the women, where the declines are much smaller, it's still a big drop. Declines of 8 to 14% in every category, with the exception of Asians, where it's only 5%. On the next slide, we're showing the effect of the pandemic by age group, just to emphasize the complete absence in these data of any evidence of the recession effect of unemployed adults returning to college. We know that there's typically a significant lag between when unemployment spikes and when students start to return to community colleges, but these numbers are no different from the fall numbers. And here we are in the spring of 2021. Unemployment hit double digits in the mid-summer of 2020. So it's been easily 8 months at this point, and we still see extremely large declines, particularly among men in every age group. And although for women, the declines among students aged 25 and older are smaller, there is still clearly no evidence of any increase or growth in the number of older students coming back to community colleges. Another thing that you see here that's not surprising is the large swing in the under 18 population. These are high school dual enrolled students. In previous years, they had been growing by 5 to 10% a year. And even there, we're now seeing 5% declines among men and 1.5% declines among women. So a complete halt or even reversal of the growth, dramatic growth that we've had in dual enrolled students at community colleges in recent years. This slide shows how the pandemic is affecting students who are in the kind of traditional pipeline. So far from the older students that we were trying to address the questions of in the previous slide, here we're talking about students who graduated from high school in 2020 and how many of them enrolled in college in the fall immediately after graduation. This is based on a relatively small sample. Compared to our college data, where we have virtually all the college data on enrollments for the entire nation in the Clearinghouse. The high schools, we have about 3,500 high schools, and this sample is representing just under 1 million high school graduates. So perhaps a third or less of the population. But what we saw, first of all, is a much steeper decline overall in fall 2020 compared to fall 2019. So the number of high school graduates going to college had been shrinking in the previous year, but by only 1 or 2 percentage points. And what we saw was relatively little variation for different types of high schools. So for example, if you look at the school poverty level, graduates from high poverty high schools and graduates from low poverty high schools in fall of 2019 both declined by about 1.5%, almost no difference by income level. Those are the blue bars there. But what happened in fall 2020, suddenly we saw a 4 times greater decline among students from high poverty schools in terms of their ability to enroll in college their first fall compared to the decline in students from low poverty schools. So again, they're both declining. They're both declining by more than they were before the pandemic, but the gap between the two has widened dramatically. And if you look at high minority and low minority schools, for example, before the pandemic, we actually saw a smaller shrinkage in the high minority high schools. So that means before the pandemic, the gap was actually narrowing somewhat between minority and majority students in terms of their ability to enroll in college immediately after graduating from high school. Whereas in the red bars in that same category, we see twice the rate of decline in students from high minority high schools. So that improvement or reduction in the gap, the equity gap, has been completely reversed by the pandemic. And we see now the minority and low-income students are doing far worse than their more advantaged peers. Let's look a little bit more closely at the graduate students now. And again, we've seen in the spring term enrollment growth in all racial and ethnic groups among US students, but a decline among international students. This decline is slightly better than it was in the fall when we had 8% fewer graduate students from international category, but it's still significant at 5%. Great. Let's just go to wrap up with a quick summary then of some of the main points, and then we'll talk about the implications. So first off, as I've been saying, the existing gaps in equity and diversity of access, particularly for the bachelor's degrees, but community colleges as well, have grown wider during the pandemic. There's some variation between the fall and the spring term, but most of the declines in upward transfer have been among Black and Hispanic students, while whites and Asians were flat or increased. So again, the gaps are widening with disadvantaged students falling further behind. We've seen that all of the age groups are affected, particularly high school dual enrollments and adult enrollments that we might have expected to see increases in during the pandemic. And we've seen a general dampening of impact on student transfer and mobility, with the exception of upward transfers. And male students seem to have been far more affected in all of these categories than female students. So let's turn to some time that I think we have now for your questions and Q&A. I've put a few points up here that I think are most salient. We've seen, again and again, the growing equity gaps. It's so clear that the pandemic and the accompanying recession and the crisis in our country as a whole has been dividing rather than uniting students in terms of access to higher education. The declines in community colleges alone raise very troubling equity concerns. The challenges for community colleges include not only fewer students coming in, but fewer students continuing. We saw lower retention rates from fall to spring within community colleges. We saw far fewer students transferring into community colleges from four-year institutions, despite expectations that that would increase the reverse transfers. And we saw more students transferring out of community colleges into four-year institutions, in many cases taking advantage of increased opportunities and even outreach by four-year institutions looking to make up some of their own enrollment shortfalls. And among the freshman enrollment declines, there's been some conversation about whether this will reverberate over time as a lost generation of high school graduates for higher education opportunity. And I think we've seen this reflected in some of the early questions that you all submitted in your registration, but I'd like to open it up for questions now after you've heard the presentation.
Hi, Doug. Hi, McYoung. We do have a few questions that have come in so far. The first one is, because you speak to many education leaders, what are you hearing from education organizations about the fall 2021 enrollment outlook?
Well, I think many colleges are optimistic. They've seen encouraging signs in overall numbers of applicants at four-year institutions. It's harder to say at the community colleges. But again, the changes in application behavior have suggested that we will see a continuing widening of equity gaps, that there are almost no increases or even declines in things like FAFSA applications and applications from students who have requested fee waivers, for example, or first-generation students. So I think the signs are still troubling, that even though many students will likely come back to campus as schools reopen and make more in-person instruction available, that the impact on low-income and disadvantaged students will continue. And I think for community colleges, so much depends on the economy and the ability of students who have been kept out of college this year to not only find the time and the motivation to return to college next fall, but also the ability to pay. And I think the impact on family finances in among lower income Americans has been so severe that many of them will look to return to work to support their families before they look to return to college.
Thank you, Doug. The next question we've got from a few individuals around dual enrollment students. So why would the dual enrollment students drop? And is there any qualitative data to illustrate these drops?
That's a very good question, and I think that the main reason is that so many students have not been attending in-person high school classes. So schools had a lot of trouble, high schools had a lot of trouble reopening in the fall. A lot of students are taking classes online, and they don't have access to the advising and the opportunities that they might get from being in school that have helped, that in the past would have streamlined their access to community college courses.
And then a similar question is, why are online and for-profit enrollments increasing?
Yeah, one thing we didn't really talk about today, but we found significant increases in online institutions, primarily online institutions, meaning those that had been online before the pandemic. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One, they have more experience and are more prepared for online instruction. They're better known for online instruction and for doing it well. So they had less of a kind of marketing hurdle to convince students that that online instruction was as good as or worthwhile compared to in classroom. And second of all, I think they have generally had a better ability to serve adult students in ways that meet their needs. And what I mean by that is with flexible courses and timing and shorter term programs that, particularly if you think of how the recession has affected unemployed adults and older students, older learners, the need for flexibility has become paramount in the current environment. So in previous recessions, I think there was more of an expectation or more of an understanding that if you were unemployed, say in 2008 or 2009, you were going to be unemployed for a long time. Your job was not coming back. This recession was very different. I think the assumptions for many workers were that jobs would snap back as soon as we sorted this pandemic thing out. And there was all that talk about a V-shaped recession. We would come right back to normal within a few months for many people. And so why would you sign up for a traditional degree program in that environment? But you might sign up for a 4-week or 6-week course at an online institution. So I think the primarily online institutions benefited and were able to take advantage of unemployed older learners in ways that traditional colleges, even though they were teaching online, were not as prepared to do.
And it's a follow-up to an earlier question. Do you think this has to do with more online education institutions or the institutions that had to scramble to become online ready in the midst of the pandemic? That online education simply doesn't work as well for low-income students?
That's a tough question. I'd be reluctant to say it doesn't work as well if they have the technology and the access that they need. I think the real hurdle here has been the large numbers of low-income students who have not had the capacity to access online courses, and the capacity includes not just the technology, although that's important, broadband and viable devices, but also if you're studying online, you need a quiet workplace at home or somewhere where you can focus on your classes. And the pandemic not only affected families' finances and their ability to provide the technology and the broadband access that learners needed, but they also put huge strains on living environments. When people were locked in and they had younger brothers and sisters and parents studying at home and working at home, often in homes that may not have been large enough to begin with, online learning became far less effective for those learners.
Thank you, Doug. And our next college is asking about, or question is asking about technical colleges specifically. So what about technical colleges? Did their enrollments increase compared to regular four-year campuses?
We didn't separate out technical colleges from community colleges generally. So I don't really have an answer to that one.
Okay, that's fair. Are students choosing to stay closer to home, or are they pursuing online degrees?
That's a great question. I think well, they're certainly pursuing online degrees in greater numbers, but as far as staying closer to home, I think that the data are mixed. One of the interesting things that we saw was the decline in reverse transfers, which again, many people thought that students who had gone far from home to four-year colleges might be transferring to community colleges in order to stay closer to home. And we saw no evidence of that. In fact, just the reverse. We saw more community college students transferring not only to four-year institutions, which are typically further from home, but more interestingly, we saw larger increases in upward transfers to four-year institutions in a different state compared to four-year upward transfers among students who were transferring to the same state. So that suggests that distance was not a factor. It also suggests that family income and relative privilege was a factor. So if you think of the type of students who are able to transfer to a four-year college in a different state, we know that the vast majority of upward transfers are going to public colleges. And so when students are choosing out of state rather than in-state public colleges, there's a huge difference in cost. And so that growth is indicative not only of a indifference to distance, but also a selection effect of students whose families are more able to afford out-of-state tuition, who have been better positioned to take advantage of the increased opportunities for upward transfer in the pandemic.
Thank you, Doug. Our second to last question is, has the pandemic caused students to stop out, shift institution types, or leave higher education entirely?
Well, that's a loaded question. Certainly, we've seen a decline in shift in institution types, but far more stopouts. And whether those will turn into leaving higher education entirely is anyone's guess. I think the longer the pandemic continues and the longer that students stay out in their stop out, there's no question that the odds of their coming back ever start to decline. And I think when we look at incoming students, in particular the freshman enrollments and the students coming straight from high school, those, there are again two very different phenomena there. There's there's the kind of gap year students who I think are more often affluent students who would have gone to a traditional on-campus four-year college, who opted to take a gap year rather than forego that traditional freshman experience. Those students, I think, are in all likelihood going to be back on campus as soon as those campuses are open in fall 2021. In contrast, I think, is more of the equity gap than the gap year. And by that, I mean the students who didn't show up as freshmen at community colleges this year. I think there it was far less of an option or a choice. These are students who are much more likely to have had no option to enroll because they could no longer afford it. They had to work to support their families or to care for family members or younger siblings. And those students will have a much harder time finding their way back onto the path to higher education next fall, even if the pandemic is completely under control by then. I think, as I said, many of them will be far more interested in entering the labor market when that recovers than they will be in returning to the college pathway.
So if I can add just one more to Doug's point of view, the students who had been enrolling prior to the pandemic hit, they tend to continue their enrollment into last fall. So there isn't really clear evidence that from the onset of pandemic, there was a huge increase in step out. We have not seen that evidence. And from the last fall to this spring, we saw a slight higher rate of attrition, but not as steep as you might have guessed. So I think if you were already enrolled student prior to pandemic, most likely if you were enrolled in four-year schools, you're likely to continue the enrollment. And only the exception is students who are first-time freshmen, as you saw the staggering data decline there, or if you were enrolled in community colleges prior to pandemic, that makes a huge difference.
Thank you, McYoung and Doug. And one last question. I know we're really close to time or at time, but with your new reports coming out, what should schools be looking for to help them with their enrollment efforts?
I think the biggest question will be how to think about the freshmen who didn't show up this fall and have yet to return this spring. And to the extent that those are traditional age students coming from high school, how do you find them and reach out to them? If you have students who have stopped out, you know who they are and you can reach out to them. But the freshmen who didn't show up are a much different question. And you can use not only the reports that we're producing to give you insights into who those students might be and where to look for them, but more importantly, I would urge you to look to the high schools and community organizations that may have been working with these students in a normal year to help them make the transition to a college, to see if you can work with them to identify who didn't show up and find ways to reach out to them. Because I think the hardest challenge for many of those students, now that they're no longer in high school, they don't have access to the advising and the support and the information flow that typically helps them bridge the transition from high school to college. So if they're out there driving Ubers or delivering groceries today, how do they get back into that flow of support, not only from college admissions officers, but from high school teachers and advisors and counselors? That's where the efforts probably should be most intensified.
Thank you, Doug. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
I'd just like to thank everyone again for coming to our session today, and I appreciate your time and your interest.
Thank you, everyone.